Hi, in this video demonstration we're going to look at how to take preference settings that we make changes in the settings application and update them in our application, and also how to take changes that we make in the application and have them reflected back in our app settings. So now in a previous video we created this preferences demo settings. So this is picking up from that previous tutorial. So in there we created a settings bundle where we set up our different preference items. So we have a group name, we have a text field for username, a text field for password, and then we have our multi-value display, which is like a drop-down list. So by creating this settings bundle, we create a settings in the settings application, right? So in here, we access that through the settings application. This is specific for our preferences demo app. And so we have our username, our password, and then our multi-value display. So the idea behind this is we can make the changes in the app, the settings app, and now we want to be able to pick up these changes and reflect them in the actual application. So if I come back out to my view controller nib file, right, our interface is blank. We don't have anything there at all. So the only thing that's been done to this project is that we've created the settings bundle. So now I'm going to come in here and set this up with some views that we can use to access and see the setting changes. So I'm just going to add a couple of buttons on here. I'm going to add a couple of text fields. And then I'm also going to add in a picker view. So I'm going to pause this for a second while I set up this interface. Okay, so my interface has a button to get the settings from our application preferences, and then we'll have a save settings buttons which will take the information that we change here and save these changes back to the application settings. And then I have a text field for username and a text field for password. So this is where we'll be able to see the information from the application settings or be able to make changes back to our application settings. And then we have a picker view, which we'll be able to use again to see which option was selected, whether it was yards or miles or kilometers, and then also to be able to change this value and update it back in the application settings. So now I need to set these up in my view controller header file. So I'm going to close the utilities panel and I'm going to open up the assistant editor. Okay, and I'm going to create some methods with the button. So I'm going to select my get settings button, right click and drag in here. I'm going to create an action, and this action is going to be get settings. I'm going to do the same thing with save settings. I'm going to create an action so that it will save the settings. I'm going to create outlets for the username, the password, and the picker view. So username, again, I'm going to right click and drag. This is going to be an outlet, and let's call this username. Repeat that for password. And also repeat that for our picker view. So this is going to also be an outlet, and I'm just going to call it distance. And one other method that I'm going to include in here is one that will retract the keyboard so that when we start typing stuff in here, we'll be able to get rid of the keyboard. So this is going to be an IB action, and we'll say done editing, and then to connect username, I'm going to right click and drag to done editing, and I'm going to right click and drag from password to done editing. And you can see if I select this and I right click, editing did end. And I also want to do this for did end on exit too, just so that when we tap the return key, it will do that. So I'm going to come up here and connect this to done editing. And I'm going to do the same thing with password. Okay, so now these should be connected, and we'll go in and set up these methods for getting the settings, saving the settings, and retracting the keyboard. So those are all the changes that I need to make in Interface Builder. So I'm going to exit out of the Assistant Editor, and our View Controller H file still needs one more thing set up in here. We're going to be working with the UI Picker view, and in order to react to any changes in that, we need to implement the data source and delegate protocols. So I'm just going to add in here the UI Picker view delegate and the UI Picker view data source. So these will give us methods that will deal with when the picker view is selecting something. That will be the UI Picker view delegate, what happens when something is changed or selected in the picker view. And the data source is going to handle populating the picker view. So now I believe our header file is completely set up, so we'll go to the View Controller implementation file and set these up. So we can see it's synthesized the username, password, and distance. And we're getting an incomplete implementation warning here. And that's probably because we have the picker view, delegate, and data source, but we don't have the required methods that those use. So we'll be adding in those methods that these require in a minute. So don't be concerned that you have that message coming up. We should be taking care of that soon. So it's synthesizing, and then we have our methods that we added in for get settings and save settings, which I'm going to take these, and I'm, again, for just making it a little easier to view in the video, I'm going to move them up here to the top. And since we typed in by hand the done editing, I need to add that in. So it's an IB action, and it was done editing, and it added a little extra in here. Okay, so now I have blocks for each of my methods that I need to implement. So first, let's do the done editing. So that is sender, resign first responder. And if this isn't familiar to you, I have a separate video on retracting the keyboard, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with that. So let's just test and make sure that that part works. Okay, the picker view is not showing up because we haven't set that up yet. But right now we're just focused on the text view to make sure that when we click return that the keyboard is indeed retracting, which it is. So let's move on. So let's move on by setting up the picker view. And in order to do that, I'm going to create an array that will have our different settings for distance. So I'm going to create an array called NS mutable array. And let's just call that array choice. And we're also going to create a string, and let's call that selected distance. Now the reason I chose an NS mutable array as opposed to just an NS array, mutable is changeable, something that can be changed or modified. So we have an array which is going to contain the options that will be in our picker view, and then our string that's going to represent which option the user has selected. And then in our viewDidLoad method, we're going to come in here and we're going to define the elements that go in the array for our picker. So let's say our array name, which is choice, and that's equal to an NS mutable array, and we're going to allocate it and initialize it into memory. And then we're just going to add in what the choices are. So in our array, we're going to say choice, add object, and this is going to be a text string with the choices that are going to appear. So we have yards, and then I'll just copy this and paste it in and change this for our different options. So we have our array with our different choices added into the array. Now that we have the array set up, we can actually start to populate that information into our picker view. So some of the things that are required in a picker view, we have to tell it the number of components and the number of items, and then we can populate the picker. So I'm going to move down in here and we'll say, just going to put a comment in here, number of components. So this method takes an integer, so this is an NS integer that gets returned to it, and the name of the method is just number of components in picker view. And so in here we can say we wanted to return 1. So what does that mean, number of components in picker view? If I go back to Interface Builder, and you can see this is our picker view, and the number of components is how many spinners there are. So in this example, there's only 1 component compared to a date picker. Let me just pull this down here. If I pull on a date picker, for example, we have 4 components. The one for the month and the date, hour, the minute, and then AM or PM. So this would be a 4-component picker. So I'll take that off of there because we really don't want that now. And when you go back to the implementation file, so this method, number of components in picker view, we're telling it exactly how many components it should have. And ours is only going to have 1 that will say yards or miles or kilometers. The next method that's required for a picker view is how many items should be in the picker view. So we'll say number of items. And again, this is going to return an NS integer because it's going to be a number value. And this method is picker view, number of rows in component. So how many things, how many rows should be in there. Now, we could do an exact number, but it's better to have it return a value that will be easily updatable, so that if we added more things into this array, we wouldn't have to remember to come down here and change that. So we wanted to return how many items are in the choice array. So I'm going to say choice count. So we know how many components, how many rows should be in there. Now we're actually going to populate the picker. And this is done with an NS string and its picker view. And as I start to type it in, it gives me the option, picker view, title for row for component. So that's the option that I want. So now in here we specify, okay, how is it going to get the title to put in for this row? And that is going to be, we wanted to return our array of our choice array, and it's going to be object at index by row. So this constitutes a row in the picker, so it's going to be the object at each row, which will be this text string. Okay, now let's test this and see what it looks like in the simulator. And you would expect by now that our picker would show up. We have all of the required methods in order to populate the picker, but it's not showing up. So I'm going to go back into Interface Builder. And one other thing that we do need to set up in here is the data source. Even though we set up in the header file, right? We set up the header file to say UI picker view delegate, which we haven't worked with that yet, but the UI picker view data source. So we say we're using this, but we haven't associated it with the picker view in Interface Builder. So I'm going to right click and drag from the picker to Files Owner, and I'm going to connect its data source. So in other words, we're saying the data source for this picker is in Files Owner, which is within our code. So we'll say we're connecting it to the data source. And then again, I'm going to right click and drag to Files Owner and say it's also the delegate, which means what's going to handle when something is selected from this. That's also in our code. So now let's see if this shows up in our simulator. And there we go. So we have some success. Now our picker is set up and our entire user interface is set up. Now one last thing with the picker is that when the user selects something in here, we need to be able to handle that selection. So I'm going to go back, let's close out of the Utilities panel, and I'm going to go back into the View Controller M file. And in order to handle when something is selected in the picker, we have another method that we can implement. Let's just say selected item, and this is a void, and let's say picker view, and we have the picker view did select row in component method. I love the names of these methods in here. They're very self-explanatory. They're long, but they're self-explanatory. So that's the whole name of the method. And so in there, what we want to have happen is we're going to say we created a variable up here called selected distance. So we created a string called selected distance. So we're going to say selected distance is equal to our choice array object at index for the row that was selected. So when something is selected in the picker view, then selected distance gets that value. So now with the interface set up and our picker view set up to display the different options that the user can select, and we're also handling or getting the value of what was selected, now we need to connect this to our settings, our application preferences. So I'm going to go into the app delegate implementation file. We don't do a lot in here, but in this case we're going to go into the did finish launching with options method, and that's because when this application loads, we're going to ask it to go out and get the application settings and then load them into our app. So in the did finish launching with options method, first we're going to initialize the settings when the app loads. So we're going to get the values from our preferences. And we access our preferences through the NS user defaults. And I'm going to pop up the utility panel over here so that we can see some information about this. Okay, it provides programmatic interface for interacting with the defaults system. So the NS user defaults allows us to access the application settings that are in our settings bundle. So we're creating a NS user defaults, a new object, and so we're going to call this, let's just call it defaults, and we're going to set that equal to NS user defaults, and it's standard user defaults. So when I click on standard user defaults, we can see it returns the shared defaults object. And I have too many brackets here, so we'll fix that. Okay, now I'm going to add some code in here, an if statement to check to see if there are defaults already set. So I'm just going to type this in so you don't have to sit here and watch me type in each line, and we'll explain the code. So I've added in our if statements in here. And basically what's happening with this is it's going to check to see if these objects are not empty. And if they are empty, then it sets the values to null, so there won't be anything there. If I go back into the root P list, you can see that these object for key, right, where these values are coming from, object for key, in the root P list is the identifier name. So user underscore name, password with a little p, and distance. So we're using those values back in here to set these objects. And then we use defaults synchronize. Synchronize will actually take this now and write those values and save them. Okay, next let's get our application to access the settings that have already been set up in the application preferences. So I'm going to go to the View Controller implementation file, and our user interface has a button that is connected to Get Settings. So in the Get Settings method is where we want to grab the information that's already in our settings. So we're going to access that through the NS user defaults object, and we're going to call that defaults. And again, that's going to be equal to NS user defaults and our standard user defaults. So we'll say username text is going to be equal to, we're going to go to our defaults and grab the object for key. and whatever is in the username, we want the key, so user underscore name. And the same thing for password. We'll say password text, and that is going to go out to the user defaults, and say object for key, and this time we want the password. So let's see if those work before we start working on getting the value from the picker. So when we hit get settings, oh actually, let me make sure that there's something in there for username and password. Username, okay. Now let's go back in to the application, and since we have something in there, it grabs the values from the two text fields. Notice that this is not being hidden from view because I just have it plain text so that we can see that, yeah, it did grab the password that we did put in, and that was intentional so that we didn't have little stars here hiding what it was, so we can be sure that it is getting the right value. Okay, so now let's see if we can get our picker here to update with the information from our application settings. So adding one in here, we're going to get the selected choice. So we'll say selected distance is equal to a string, and we have to allocate it, and we're going to init with string, and that string is going to be our defaults object for key, and the key is distance. All right, we want this object for key to come from our p list, which is the identifier is distance. And I have an error here. Oh, need an extra closing square bracket. Okay, so that just puts the value from what's in the selected preference into selected distance. Next, we need to create an integer that represents the value of the selected row. So I'm going to say, let's call it selected row, and that's going to be equal to our choice array, index of object, and the index of the object of what was our selected distance. So we'll say selected distance. Once we have that, then we can actually display it in the picker. So we'll say distance, which is our picker, right? We synthesized our picker before as distance. So now we're saying targeting our picker called distance. Select row is going to be selected row. So it's going to tell it to select the row that matches selected row, which is our choice from the selected distance. In component 0, so we only have one component, so it's going to be 0, and animated yes. So now I'm going to run this and we'll test it. Now before I test this, I'm going to go into the settings and I'm just going to show what the preferences has. We have our username, password, and the distance is in kilometers. So when we tap that button to get the settings, we want to make sure, or we want to verify that it does change the picker to choose kilometers. So we'll go back and run the application. So right now yards is the default, and so it did update to kilometers, and it did still grab the username and password and put it in. So now we have it going one way into our application from our application preferences, where we can grab those settings and use them in here. Next step, if we make a change in this with the username, the password, or the distance, we want to save these settings so that they go back into the application preferences and update. So let's look at how to do that. So back in the implementation file, right, our user interface is already set up so that our save button is coming to the save settings method. So we're going to set this up and take the values that are in our screen and save them to the application preferences. So again, we need to grab the NS user defaults. So I'm just going to copy this and put it in here, so we can refer to our default object through default. And then for grabbing the information from the text field, we're going to say defaults set object, and let's say our object is username. So our text field, text for the key username. So we're going to set the object username text. We're going to replace that, or we're going to take that text and put it in for the key of username. So before we try the password and then the picker view, let's just see if that part works. So let me run this in the simulator, and I'm going to get the settings right now so we can see we have test in here. So I'm going to change this to ABC, save settings. Now nothing happens here, and that's because we didn't program it to do anything, but we'll pop up an alert in a second. Let's go back out to the settings, and it updated the username. So now if I change this to something else, and I go back into our application and I get the settings, then it updates. So we've got username going back and forth. We can change it in the application, or we can change it back in the application preferences. So we'll set up password to do the same. So I'm just going to copy that, paste that in, and change our password to password. And we'll go ahead and do the picker view, and it's still set object. We'll set the object for selected distance, and we want to apply that to the key for distance. And then once these are all finished, then we want to synchronize them. Okay, let's save and see if we can go back and forth. I guess the other thing we should do in here is let's put in an alert so that we know that it got that far and it's supposedly saving our settings. Okay, so I've just added the code in here real quick for an alert that'll say that it's saved, and so we know that this part should be working. So let's run this in the simulator. And to begin with, I'm going to get the settings that are already there. So it's set for miles. And I'm going to change this to kilometers. We already tested these other, and so we know they work. So I'm going to choose Save Settings, an alert. So now I'm going to go into the application preferences and make sure that kilometers has been updated. And here's kilometers. So now if I change this to miles, and then I go back into my application and I say get settings, this updates to miles. And if I change to yards and save settings, it says it's updated. We go back to settings, and there's nothing set here. It's not set. All right, let me go back in here and just try that again. Save settings. Come back in here. It's still not picking up that I changed it to yards. So let's see what's going on here. We have distance. Go into the root P list again. I say miles, feet in kilometers, and I have it coded everywhere else for yards. All right. Now let's see if that works. So I'm going to get the settings. Let me change this to miles. Save. And we'll check it. Miles. Now we'll go back. I'm going to change this to yards. And save it. And go back and see, well, it says feet because I didn't change the name down here. Right? It's the value here, but this is what shows up on the titles on the component. All right, so that should do it. One final test on here. Get settings. Change this to miles and save it. Miles. Go back into the app. Change it to yards, which wasn't working before. And now go into the application preferences, and yards is showing up. Okay, so now we're able to go between both your application preferences, which is in the settings application, and then we can also go from within the application, make changes to things, and then save them back into our application preferences.